When someone mentions witchcraft today, like what exactly do you think of? It might be like Harry Potter books or kids' stories, epic fantasy novels, something to dress as for Halloween. Maybe you think of Wiccans who, you know, I don't have a problem with. They mostly mean well, they have some lovely ideas, but who ultimately, like, they don't have magic powers, you know? I guess what I'm saying is, when you say witches today, we don't really think of anything all that serious. But it wasn't always this way. Once upon a time, declaring someone a witch was as good as a death sentence for them. So, I decided, with Halloween coming up, we would look a little bit into the history of witchcraft in the UK, and I decided to travel down to Kent to explore a little bit of that history. The idea of witches being bad stretches back literally thousands of years. Parts of the Bible, suspected to have been written back as early as like 560 BC, literally condemn witchcraft. It's always been this fear for people. However, there wasn't a huge amount of hysteria around it until much later. In the late 1200s, Thomas Aquinas, who was this Dominican monk apparently, he started to stir the pot a little bit. He claimed the world was full of evil and dangerous demons who were trying to maliciously lead men and women into temptation. And how did they do this? Well, mostly through sex. Fast forward to 1484, and this is when things really start to get bad. Pope Innocent VIII. He started to get people really worked up. There was so much like politics going on at the time. There was disagreements, people wanting power, different religions fighting with each other and so on. It was a bit of a mess. And this resulted in the Pope announcing that there were apparently Satanists in Germany who were intent on, and I quote, meeting with demons, casting spells that destroyed crops, and aborting infants. He then commissioned 2 friars to publish a report about witchcraft. And this is kind of what kickstarted all the witch trials and mass hysteria everywhere. This report was known as, and I'm hoping I don't butcher this pronunciation, the Malleus Maleficarum. And it was full of these like hyperbolic, fear-mongering stories about mostly women who would apparently, and again I quote, have sex with any convenient demon, kill babies, and even steal penises. Sounds like typical woman behaviour to me. I joke, but this was really serious, and as a result, Christians were told they had an obligation to hunt and kill disgusting witches. It wasn't just a warning, it was a call to action. Over the next years, this report was tweaked and edited and republished a number of times, and it soon became the go-to guide for recognising and condemning suspected witches. This was the breaking point. It was all downhill from here. People began to get genuinely hysterical. Matt Haig writes in his book, Notes on a Nervous Planet, which is fantastic, and anyone who has issues with anxiety or wants to understand about it should definitely read it. I'm reading it at the minute and it's wonderful. Not the point though. Matt Haig writes in this book that it's not sex that sells, but fear. And Pope Innocent's message was, you know, combining both of those, sex and fear. His message was pure fear-mongering. It spread throughout Europe so quickly. You've got to remember as well that the people hearing these stories, they were often poor, starving, struggling. They faced war, famines, plagues, and they were being told that all these problems that they had were the fault of witches and demons. And so if you want all your problems to go away, simply kill them. It seemed almost too good to be true. It's this easy solution, and it's very easy to see why people believed it and got worked up and got so scared about this. Most of Europe was affected, and the UK, you know, was a part of this as well. Just because we're an island doesn't mean we weren't affected by it. Not by a long way. In 1542, witchcraft was declared a crime in the UK, and just over 20 years later, it was upgraded, so not only was it a crime, but it was a crime punishable by death. Up in Scotland, this often meant witch burnings, but in the UK, it was more hangings. We didn't really burn witches here. That's, you know, a little bit of a, I guess, urban legend. Hanging was the way we did it, apparently. By the beginning of the 1600s, the Lord Chief Justice Anderson announced, and again I quote, that the land is full of witches. They abound in all places. He and others like him claimed that witches were a deadly threat to life, livelihood, and divine order in the UK. And so people began to look for witches everywhere, in their neighbours, in their friends, even family. You would literally have friends and family accusing one another, shouts of, he's a witch, she's a witch, they're a witch, even children were accused. The worst years were probably between about 1645 and 1646, when Matthew Hopkins declared himself Witchfinder General. Hopkins was a very interesting character, because he'd been a pretty unsuccessful lawyer up to this point, but when this whole hysteria around witches, kind of came out, he saw it as a payday, and he made the most of it. And it's easy to see why, too. At a time when the average yearly wage was around £6.50, Hopkins was paid between £6 and £23 for every town he cleared of witches. He could literally make between 1 and 4 times the yearly wage in a weekend. It's easy to see why he did it. He was quick and he was ruthless. Records showed that in Bury St Edmunds, he once put 68 people to death in a single day, while over in Chelmsford, he had 19 supposed witches hanged in one day. It's insane. And when we say, 68 witches, 19 witches, it sounds very abstract. No, this man had 68 and 19 innocent people killed so that he could get paid. That's the reality, and it's horrific. Chelmsford was just one story, though. I visited a gorgeous little town called Faversham in Kent to see the town's old water pump, which was the site of witch hangings back in the 1600s. It looks like any other English town today, but just 400 years ago, this gorgeous little quaint area was the site of the torture and murder of hundreds of innocent people, mostly women, sentenced to death purely out of fear roused by fundamentalist religious extremists. It's terrifying. Seriously. I then decided to head over to Canterbury, which again, absolutely beautiful. A gorgeous little town, city. I loved it. And I went to see their old witch's ducking chair. The process of finding and testing witches, it differed all over Europe and North America. Different countries, different towns, different people, they had different methods. A common method of identifying witches that came from the Malleus Maleficarum was employed by Witchfinder General Matthew Hopkins, who we've mentioned. He would look for devil's marks, he called them. So we're talking things like moles, warts, even flea bites, spots. Basically, any of these things could be considered a sign of the devil, that the devil had marked you. And then these marks had to be tested. The theory was, if they were real devil's marks and not just an innocent mole, you could jab them and they wouldn't feel pain. So Hopkins would use this large, long stick with this 3-inch needle on the end of it, right? Looked terrifying. And Hopkins wasn't just ruthless, he was creative as well. And he called this his jabbing needle. Yeah. So Hopkins would jab the needle, this 3-inch needle, into any of these marks on women. And if they felt pain, if they squealed out, they were innocent. But if they didn't feel anything other than a little bit of pressure, they were clearly a witch, right? I mean, surely everyone passed this test, right? Being jabbed with a needle. That's gotta hurt. But you have to remember that Hopkins, if he wanted to get paid, he had to clear a town of witches. And he had to identify as many as possible. So I guess we have to ask, was Hopkins just really lucky in finding hundreds and hundreds of men, women, and children who couldn't feel pain in certain parts of their body? Or was it perhaps a scam? Scam, it was a scam. We know this. The jabbing needle was later revealed. This is ridiculous and so dark. The needle itself was spring-loaded into the stick. So basically, the minute any pressure was applied to the end of that needle, it just retracted into the stick. No one was actually jabbed with a needle. No skin was ever broken. There was no jab. There was nothing to feel. It was all a scam, and people died because of it. Jabbing was not the only test, though. I'm sure you've heard plenty of stories of strange and unfair tests, for example, the swimming test, right? Over in Bedford, there are records, especially around this one called Mary Sutton, who was accused of witchcraft. And so they made her do, the swimming test. Basically, they tied her thumbs to the toes, the big toes of the opposite feet. So right thumb was tied to the left toe, left thumb was tied to the right toe. So she's there all bundled up, all tied together. And then they threw her in a pond. The idea was if she floated, she was clearly a witch. If she drowned, she was innocent. And, they'd issue an apology for killing an innocent woman. But what they didn't consider was, basic physics. Turns out, you fling anyone into a pond like that, they're gonna float. It's a survival mechanism that we have. So basically, poor Mary was dead no matter what happened to her. In the case of Mary, she floated, they fished her out of the pond, and they hanged her. Another reasonably common test was called ducking, and this is what happened in Canterbury, and this is why I went to go see the ducking chair. They at least will have a replica of their old ducking stall. It's probably not the original, like bits have been replaced and repaired over time, but here it is, the ducking stall. Kind of interesting, kind of intriguing. Such a dark history. So this ducking stall is like suspended over the river, right? And picture the water at this time. It's filthy, it's stinking, it's filled with human and animal waste. Like, you do not want to go in there. Whoever they accused of witchcraft would be made to sit in the stall and would be dunked in the river for several minutes. Basically just held in there in this stinking feces-filled water. Just like the swimming test though, the logic here was completely flawed too. The idea was that they would be dunked, and if the accused emerged from the water still alive, she was declared a witch. And, sentenced to death. But if she drowned, well, too bad, she was clearly innocent, and the family would receive a formal apology from the church. Makes everything better, doesn't it? This wasn't the only use for the stall though. Later on, in the 1800s, it was used as a punishment for women or deceitful businessmen. Mostly women. If a woman was thought to have been gossiping too much or nagging her husband too much, then the husband would literally pay to use the ducking stall. Again, the water at this time, disgusting. Filthy, stinking, feces-filled. And he would pay to have his wife paraded through the town, humiliated, and then dunked in the filthy river. Not enough to drown them, but enough to humiliate them. Sometimes, the ducking stall could be moved as well, so moved up and down the river. So sometimes it said just as a warning, the husband or whoever, or a disgruntled customer, something like that, would pay to have the ducking stall just moved outside someone's house as a warning or a way to humiliate them. Basically a threat. They're saying oh, bitch, you continue to nag me and I'll get you dunked. That kind of thing. But anyway, back to witches. After identifying a witch and doing these tests, they had to get a confession before they could actually kill the witch. And this is where torture comes in. It's safe to say that most confessions were coerced, which is no surprise really. Accused witches would be beaten, deprived of sleep, not fed, or made to walk continuously for days without food or even being able to stop to go to the toilet. They would be walking around covered in their own excrement and made to walk through towns, through cities with no sleep, while a cleric would be following them, Bible in hand, asking leading questions until they got a confession. It was barbaric. The numbers aren't exactly clear or known. Different records suggest different things, but from what I could find, the consensus was that it seems to be an estimated 200,000 supposed witches were tortured in Western Europe between the mid-1400s and mid-1700s. And of these, around 40 to 50,000 were actually put to death, whether that was hanging or burning or drowning, anything. That's a disgusting number of innocent people to kill. And like I say, while a number of these were men, they were mostly women. One source I read claimed that women were more likely to be accused of witchcraft because, and I quote, people believed women to be morally and spiritually weaker than men, and therefore particularly vulnerable to diabolic persuasion. Seriously. I know people were acting out of fear. There was mass hysteria, pressure from religious leaders, political leaders, the monarchy, every angle. People were being made to fear witches. There were messages everywhere that witches are bad. They're the cause of all our problems. We must find them and kill them and get rid of them, and that's the only way we're all going to be happy and safe again. I understand that people were obviously caught up in this hysteria and acting emotionally rather than rationally. I understand it, but it's still so upsetting to think of the hundreds of thousands of people tortured and killed because of this, and whose deaths were literally celebrated and paid for. It's disgusting, and it's inhumane, and it's something we shouldn't allow to happen ever again. And the scary thing was, this isn't the only case of mass hysteria that we've seen. There are so many stories out there on the internet. Some are bizarre and not too serious, like the dancing plague of, I think it was 1518, which if you haven't heard of it, go Google it. It's very interesting, kind of bizarre, and it shows how people get swept up in kind of following what others are doing and so on. While other cases of mass hysteria and people getting worked up and demonizing people are far more serious. Look at the Nazi Party. World War II happened because the Nazi Party stirred up hysteria in not only Germany, but so many parts of Eastern Europe that said that mostly Jewish people, but others, were evil and deserved to be killed. It was just a kind of more up-to-date version of the witch trials and witch hunts that we saw 400 years before. I guess what I'm trying to say is that while witch trials are an interesting bit of history, and it can be like, ooh, witches, they're quite fun to talk about for Halloween, the truth is, it was a horrific, disturbing thing that happened, and there's something we can learn from this. We've all seen what happens when people get swept up in the crowd and a group of people get demonized. We know what happens, and it's never good. Innocent people get hurt and killed. And we need to make sure that as a society, we never, ever let that happen again. Really think about the judgments you make about people and why you're making them, and mostly look out for one another and be kind. Anyway, that's me done for today. Thank you for watching this video, taking the time. I appreciate you guys so much, and I hope everyone has a fun, happy, and safe Halloween. And don't go accusing people of being witches. I'll see you guys soon.